Cool. So I'm Talia. I'm a developer advocate at Split. And before I was a developer advocate, I used to be a test engineer, and I worked in QA and automation and testing for a while. And being a test engineer was really hard because most of the problems that I had revolved around staging and using like this dummy environment. And most companies use a staging environment to test. And it would cause so many issues. And these are some of the problems that I've dealt with that I'm sure you guys have also dealt with. So the first is data mismatch. So the data in staging does not match the data in production, which means the test results don't always match, right? And as a test engineer, I used to work so hard on testing every product requirement. I used to go through all the documentation with the product owner, and I worked with the developers to fix all the bugs, and I made sure my end-to-end tests were passing. And then I would sign off on the feature, and as soon as it's launched to production, there would be a bug. And it's such a horrible feeling as an engineer when there's all this pressure on you to make sure that this feature works in a dummy environment. The other issue is configuration drift. So let's say you get paged one night because there's an incident for your application, and you look at the logs and you identify the problem. But in order to fix it, you have to update a specific configuration in production. So you make the change in production and then you go back to sleep because it's in the middle of the night. But even though you fixed the issue, you've just created an even bigger divide between your staging and production environments because you didn't make the same change in your staging environment. So many times staging environments are not the same as production because of changes made during incident management. And this is called configuration drift. So I thought, what's the point of testing and staging if it's not going to give me the same test results as production? There's also really bad performance in staging. So a lot of times when you're writing tests in staging, you often have to add waits and sleeps because things take longer to load. And that's not how users are going to interact with your features in prod. They're not going to wait 10 seconds for a button to appear and then click on it and then wait 10 seconds for something else to appear. Like, that's not how users are going to interact with your features. Also, nobody cares if staging is down. So I would be assigned to fix these hotfix tickets, which were just critical bug fixes that needed to be immediately released to production. So I would log into staging to test it, but staging would be down, so then you ping the DevOps guy, and he tells me they're doing performance testing in staging, so I have to wait until that's done. And then I try logging in again after that, but this time I get the 404 screen of death, so I open an IT ticket, and then I have to get it escalated by my manager, but she's at lunch, so I have to ping someone else. And meanwhile, all I'm trying to do is test this high priority ticket, and nobody seems to care. So I was so fed up with dealing with just a really bad staging environment and being blamed for when things didn't work. And as an engineer, any type of engineer, if you're a front-end engineer, back-end engineer, test engineer, you're constantly looked at as if you build the feature, you got to make sure it works. If you wrote the test, you got to make sure it works in production. So you're kind of the gatekeeper of these features. And I thought there has to be a better way to test software because my users are not going to use staging to log in. They're going to use production to log in. So I did a ton of homework, and I researched what other companies are doing. And this is what I learned. So it's the norm for companies to use staging environments, especially companies that are still waterfall. And most companies also have more than one staging environment. Also, big name companies like Google, Facebook, Netflix, Twitter, all of them test in production. And when I read this, I was so confused. I was like, what do you mean test in production? What is that? How is that possible? And so testing in production means testing your features in the environment where your features will live in. And I thought, wow, this is perfect. And this solves the problems that I have with my staging environment. I also learned that testing in prod doesn't mean you only test in prod. You still use staging for GDPR and SOX compliance stuff, things that are related to data and privacy issues. You can still use staging for. And I thought I have to start doing this. So I looked into the how. How is this possible? And the answer was feature flags. So feature flags are a way to separate code deployment from feature release. So the idea is you deploy your code to production behind a feature flag, test it in prod, and then release the feature with the click of a button as soon as it's bug-free. And this is kind of what it looks like in my head. So our developers would create a feature flag from the UI, so whatever feature flagging system you're using, and then target all of your internal teammates. So this includes dev, QA, product, design. So anything related to the feature can only be seen by the users that are inside of the feature flag because the default for the flag is off right now. So the people on the right, the real end users, can't see anything related to the features because they're not targeted. And so when the feature flag is off, you go in and you test everything. You test all the functionality, you test your design, you go through all the requirements, you just make sure that everything works. And if you happen to find a bug in your new feature, it has no impact on your end users because they don't have access to it. Again, they're not targeted. And then once you know your feature is working in production, you turn the flag on, already knowing 100% that your features are working in production and you didn't break anything that was existing. And now your users are happy and they're dancing because they have a perfect feature. And I thought that's all wonderful, like this is a great process, but how do you automate it? Like you can't possibly manually test every feature every time you release. And with feature flags, you have this added complexity. So how do you automate it? And there's two ways here. There's two options for automation. So the first is to target your test users and automate the flows with them. So every time automation bot A logs in, they have access to the feature regardless because they are on the whitelist for this feature. So then you would take automation bot A and target that inside of the feature flag and run your automation scripts with automation bot A. And the only problem with this is that there's increased fragility because think about if someone removes automation bot A from that list, then all of your tests are going to fail. So you just have to watch out for your management of your feature flags and your management of your automation bots. The other option is to override your feature flags. So you would make a custom feature flag abstraction, which makes it easy to mock out in your test. So for each feature, you would have 3 tests. So in the first test, you simulate your feature flag on. And so for this test duration, if you get any request asking if the feature flag is on from the test, you say yes. In the second test, you simulate the feature flag is off. And if any requests come in from the test asking if the feature flag is on, you say no. And in the last test, you want to validate that you can go through the entire flow regardless of if the flag is on or off. So with this approach, you're really explicit in the test, and the test becomes much more self-documenting and descriptive. So whenever any test runs in a system under test using feature flags, you would fake out all the variants of the experiment. And because it's fake, you reduce the complexity of the different scenarios, which means faster tests. So basically what you're doing is you're declaratively setting the state of the flag for the duration of the test. And then when you run these tests in production, you want to make sure that your tests only interact with other testing entities in production. So what you do is you have this back-end flagging system in production. So something like a Boolean that's set to is test equals true or is test user equals true. Something that differentiates your real users and your real test objects from your test objects. So in this way, you can separate test data from real data in your data dashboard. So if you have a bunch of flows running in production and some of them are test flows and some of them are real flows, if you have these identifying characteristics, then in your data dashboard in Looker or Datadog, whatever you're using, you can say everything with is test is true. You're going to be in this bucket. In this dashboard, everything with is test is false. You're going to be over here where my product people and the people who don't need to see what the tests are doing can see over here. And so the tests are looking for these specific elements with these specific test attributes in production. And if the test doesn't find it, it's going to fail and you're going to get alerted. So you can use ARIA labels. You can use just some other like data QA, data attributes for this. You have a few options here. There are exceptions when you run these in production. So if your software is integrated with a third party, it can be tricky to test. So Something that works for third parties is to create a unique header in the API request that you send to the third party and say, hey, any request that you get with this header is a test, and I want you to treat it this other way. So sometimes you have to make these exceptions because of different variants in production. So besides feature flags, there are some other dependencies that you need. So the first one is an automation framework. It's not scalable to manually test everything in production. So you just want to make sure that you have some sort of automation framework in place. You also need a job scheduler, so something that's going to run your tests every night, every incrementally, however often you decide, just something that you don't have to think about when you're going to run your tests. And then an alerting tool to be alerted when a test fails. So these are the recommended tools that I've used for testing in prod. So for feature flagging, Split is great. An automation framework, I love Robot Framework. I love Robot Framework. It's so easy to use. There's a keyword-driven library that just makes it super user-friendly. For job schedulers, Jenkins, Circle CI, I don't really have a preference. And then alerting, PagerDuty, Slack. Okay, so this new process makes total sense to me, but if it's so simple, why isn't everyone testing in production? Why do staging environments still exist if you have this process that solves all of your problems? So the reason is that people are scared. So companies don't test in production because of this fear and lack of trust in their systems, and for the same reason, they refuse to engage in the tools and process changes that will generate that trust. So they're too afraid of the risks. And there's a few things you can do to mitigate the risks of testing in prod. The first one is, like I said, use feature flags before you launch. So target your teammates, test with them, and then turn on the feature when you know it's working in prod. You can also use a canary release, which is also called a percentage rollout. So this allows you to release your feature to a small subset of users before you roll it out to your entire user base. Just in case something goes wrong, you would only affect a smaller percentage of your user base. And then start with an AA test. So this means you give both sets of users in and out of the feature flag the same experience. And you can also just start small. Don't start out with the most complex flow and decide to test that in prod. Start with something simple. And so the outcome of this process is that you can release faster. You will have increased developer velocity because you spend more time creating new features and less time fixing bugs. You also have a really great confidence in your releases because you already know your features are working in the environment that they will live in, not a dummy environment. And you also have increased team happiness because it's just a really great thing for engineering culture when you're testing in prod. And if I haven't convinced you that this is a good idea, I want everyone to think of the last feature that your team deployed. You're thinking about it. Okay, is it working? Right now, in production? How do you know? Your users haven't reported anything to you, your alarms haven't gone off, so you don't actually know, right? Testing in production is the only way to know that your features are working right now in production. And it does require a culture shift, and a lot of times shifting your company's testing culture is the hardest part of this process. So a good idea is to use examples from your past when you're talking to your peers about this. Is your staging environment unreliable? I can tell you for a fact, yes, it is. And then if you haven't used feature flags before, go to split.io. You can create a free developer account and just start messing around with feature flags if you haven't used them yet. And in case you haven't been paying attention at all for the past 15 minutes, I want you to take away two things. So the first is that no one cares if your feature is working in staging. We care if it works in production. And the only way to know if it's working in prod is to test it in prod. Again, this is my contact information, my Twitter, my email. If you guys have questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can tweet me or email me. But thank you so much for having me.